The cruelest mistakes are often made in rooms filled with applause. The crystal chandeliers of the Whitmore estate scattered golden light across the grand ballroom as nearly 200 of Manhattan's most influential guests gathered beneath ceilings painted by artists whose names belonged in museums. Laughter drifted through the air. Champagne glasses shimmered. A string quartet played softly near the marble staircase. To everyone watching, it looked like a celebration of legacy, wealth, and family. But for Naomi Whitmore, it felt strangely different. Standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River, she smoothed her fingers along the sleeve of her elegant black gown and watched the city lights blink beneath the November sky. 8 years. 8 years of marriage to Ethan Whitmore. 8 years of standing beside him through every challenge, every expansion, every sleepless night spent helping him build the empire that now stretched across 3 continents. Yet tonight, a quiet unease settled in her chest. Perhaps it was the way Ethan had barely spoken to her all evening. Or perhaps it was the way his attorney, Vanessa Sinclair, seemed glued to his side, whispering into his ear whenever she thought nobody was looking. Naomi forced herself to smile as another guest stopped to congratulate her. She thanked them graciously, her voice calm and warm, the same voice that had comforted frightened employees during company layoffs and reassured anxious investors during difficult years. People trusted Naomi. Not because she carried the Whitmore name, but because she carried herself with quiet dignity. Across the room, Ethan stood surrounded by executives and board members. At 38, he looked every bit the Billionaire business magazines loved to feature on their covers. Tall. Confident. Impeccably dressed. The kind of man whose presence commanded attention before he even spoke. Once, when he looked at Naomi, his eyes softened. Once, she had been the first person he called with good news and the last person he spoke to before falling asleep. Tonight, however, there was distance in his expression. A distance she could neither measure nor explain. The grandfather clock near the staircase struck 8. Conversations gradually faded. Guests turned toward the elevated platform at the front of the ballroom. The reading of the Whitmore family inheritance was about to begin. Naomi watched as attorneys organized documents and family members moved toward their reserved seats. Somewhere in the crowd, reporters adjusted cameras. This was not merely a private family event. The future ownership of billions of dollars in assets was about to be revealed. Ethan approached her for the first time in nearly an hour. For a brief moment, Naomi felt relief. Maybe the tension she sensed was only stress. Maybe tonight would pass peacefully. But when he stopped in front of her, his face remained unreadable. His voice was low. Controlled. Almost cold. After this is over, we need to talk. Naomi searched his eyes. Is everything okay? For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Regret. Doubt. Fear. Then it disappeared. We'll talk afterward, he said. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away. Naomi stood frozen beneath the chandelier light. Around her, guests resumed smiling. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. Yet suddenly the room felt colder than the November wind outside. She didn't know it yet, but before the night ended, the man she loved would ask her to leave. He would believe he was protecting his future. He would believe he was making the right choice. And in doing so, he would set in motion the greatest mistake of his entire life. People often notice the person standing in the spotlight. They rarely see the one quietly holding the light in place. As attorneys arranged thick folders on the stage and guests settled into their seats, Naomi remained near the window, her gaze fixed on the reflection staring back from the glass. The woman looking back at her was not the same woman who had first met Ethan Whitmore 8 years earlier. Back then, she had been a financial consultant working 70-hour weeks at a respected Manhattan advisory firm. Her apartment had been small, her savings modest, and her future uncertain. Ethan had not yet become one of the most recognizable names in American business. Whitmore Holdings existed, but barely. It occupied a rented office floor overlooking a parking garage in Newark, New Jersey. The company had only 23 employees and more ambition than resources. Most people saw risk. Naomi saw possibility. Their first meeting had happened during a funding presentation. Ethan had walked into the conference room carrying a laptop, a stack of spreadsheets, and enough confidence to fill the entire building. Investors challenged him. Analysts questioned him. One by one, people pointed out flaws in his projections. Naomi remembered watching him refuse to back down. There was something admirable about his determination. After the meeting ended, she stayed behind and reviewed his numbers. 3 hours later, she handed him a revised financial strategy. One that eventually secured the funding he desperately needed. Ethan never forgot it. Neither did she. What began as professional respect slowly became friendship. Then partnership. Then love. During those early years, they celebrated victories with takeout containers balanced on conference tables. They spent weekends reviewing contracts. They stayed awake past midnight discussing expansion plans while the city slept outside their apartment windows. When investors walked away, Naomi encouraged him. When competitors attacked the company publicly, Naomi defended it. When Ethan doubted himself, Naomi reminded him who he was. The world credited Ethan for building an empire. Naomi never corrected them. She never needed recognition. Seeing him succeed had always felt like enough. Across the ballroom, Ethan stood speaking with Vanessa Sinclair. The attorney leaned closer, saying something that caused his expression to tighten. Naomi watched for only a moment before looking away. Lately, conversations with Ethan had become shorter. Dinners had become quieter. The distance between them had grown so gradually that she could not identify exactly when it began. She only knew it was there now, stretching wider with every passing month. A server offered her a glass of sparkling water. Naomi accepted with a grateful smile. Around her, members of the Whitmore family filled the front rows. Some welcomed her warmly. Others merely tolerated her presence. Despite 8 years of marriage, there were relatives who still treated her as though she had wandered into a room where she did not belong. Naomi had learned long ago not to take it personally. Character revealed itself most clearly through kindness, not status. The orchestra finished its final piece. Silence slowly settled over the ballroom. The lead attorney approached the podium and adjusted his microphone. Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned forward. Naomi felt her heartbeat slow as anticipation spread through the room. The future of the Whitmore legacy was about to be revealed. What she did not know was that the decisions made years earlier, behind closed doors and hidden inside sealed documents, had already begun moving pieces across a board she could not yet see. And before the night was over, the sacrifices she had quietly made for nearly a decade would be measured against something far more powerful than money. The attorney cleared his throat and the final whispers vanished from the ballroom. Even the cameras seemed quieter as every eye turned toward the stage. Naomi took her seat near the front beside Ethan, smoothing the fabric of her black gown while the enormous portrait of the late Richard Whitmore watched from above the fireplace. For decades, Richard had been the undisputed patriarch of the family, a man whose decisions shaped industries and whose opinions carried the weight of law within the Whitmore name. Now his final wishes were about to be revealed. The lead attorney adjusted his glasses and began reading from the official document. The opening provisions were expected. Several charitable foundations received additional funding. Family properties were distributed among relatives. Investment holdings were divided according to long-established plans. Around the room, shoulders relaxed. A few family members even smiled. Everything appeared routine. Then the attorney reached a section marked with a red ribbon. His expression shifted. So did the atmosphere. The room seemed to lean forward all at once. The following provision, he announced carefully, shall remain binding regardless of any future disputes. Ethan straightened beside Naomi. Across the aisle, Vanessa Sinclair folded her arms and listened intently. The attorney continued. Control of the Whitmore Legacy Trust shall not automatically transfer through bloodline succession alone. The designated steward must demonstrate the character, judgment, and leadership standards established by Richard Whitmore. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience. Several family members exchanged puzzled looks. This was unusual. Extremely unusual. Richard Whitmore had always valued family tradition. Why introduce a condition now? Naomi noticed Ethan's jaw tighten. The attorney continued reading. The identity of the designated steward shall remain confidential until the conditions specified in the accompanying sealed documents have been fulfilled. This time the murmurs grew louder. Reporters immediately began scribbling notes. Board members looked toward one another with concern. Confidential? Sealed documents? None of them had expected surprises tonight. Naomi glanced at Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on the stage. Cold. Focused. Unreadable. Beside him, Vanessa leaned closer and whispered something into his ear. Naomi could not hear the words, but she saw the effect instantly. His expression darkened. Across the room, several Whitmore relatives were already speculating. Some believed the future steward was another family member. Others suspected Richard had placed temporary restrictions on control of the trust. Nobody seemed certain. The uncertainty itself created tension. The attorney finished the section and announced that additional documents would remain under legal review before their contents could be disclosed. That statement landed like a stone in still water. Questions multiplied. Answers remained hidden. The meeting moved forward, but the mood had changed completely. The celebration was gone. In its place stood suspicion, ambition, and quiet fear. Naomi folded her hands in her lap. Something felt wrong. Not because of the inheritance itself, but because of the way people were reacting to it. She saw calculations behind smiles. She saw relatives choosing sides before the game had even begun. Most of all, she saw Ethan becoming more distant with every passing minute. When the session finally paused for a brief intermission, he stood without looking at her. Vanessa followed immediately. Together they disappeared through a side doorway reserved for executives and legal counsel. Naomi watched them leave, unaware that decisions were already being made behind closed doors. Decisions based on assumptions. Decisions that would soon alter the course of every life connected to the Whitmore name. The executive corridor beyond the ballroom was silent except for the distant hum of conversations drifting through closed doors. Ethan stood beside a wall of glass overlooking the river, his reflection staring back at him beneath the city lights. Vanessa Sinclair placed a folder on the polished conference table and carefully opened it. Inside were legal summaries, trust projections, and notes prepared by analysts over the previous week. You need to think clearly, she said. If Richard placed conditions on succession, the board will start looking for weaknesses. Ethan remained silent. His father had spent a lifetime preparing him to lead. The possibility that control might somehow depend on someone else felt impossible. Yet the language in the inheritance documents had introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty was dangerous. Vanessa slid another document across the table. The board is already nervous. Investors hate unanswered questions. If the designated steward turns out to be someone outside direct succession, your position could become complicated. Ethan looked down at the report. Several names appeared throughout the analysis. One appeared more frequently than the others. Naomi. His expression hardened. That does not make sense, he said. She has never been involved in family governance. Vanessa hesitated before responding. Not officially. The words lingered in the room. Ethan knew Naomi had earned the respect of employees, executives, and even some shareholders. People trusted her. They listened to her. Over the years, she had become a quiet but influential presence throughout the company. He had once admired that. Tonight, however, doubt began planting roots where trust used to live. Back in the ballroom, Naomi remained seated while guests mingled during the intermission. Several family members gathered nearby, discussing theories about the inheritance. Most ignored her completely. A few offered polite smiles. One elderly woman approached and squeezed her hand gently. "Richard always saw things others missed," she said before walking away. Naomi watched her disappear into the crowd. The comment felt oddly significant, though she could not explain why. Moments later, Ethan returned. His face looked different now. Not angry. Not emotional. Simply distant. Like a door quietly closing. "Can we talk somewhere private?" he asked. Naomi nodded. Together they walked toward a smaller sitting room adjacent to the ballroom. The space was elegant and quiet, illuminated by soft amber lamps and the glow of a fireplace. Once inside, Ethan closed the door behind them. For several seconds neither spoke. Naomi studied his face. The man standing before her looked exhausted. Burdened. As though he had been carrying a weight alone for a very long time. "What is this really about?" she asked softly. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Everything is changing." "Then we face it together," Naomi replied. The answer should have comforted him. Instead, something in his expression tightened. He turned away and stared into the fire. Sometimes people grow in different directions. Naomi felt a quiet ache in her chest. Not because of the words themselves, but because they sounded rehearsed. As though they had been repeated internally long before tonight. "Ethan," she said carefully, "look at me." He finally did. For a brief moment she saw conflict in his eyes. Then it vanished beneath cold determination. Outside, the inheritance meeting was preparing to resume. Inside, something far more important was beginning to break. And neither of them yet understood how costly that moment would become. Naomi held his gaze for several long seconds. The fire crackled softly between them, casting shifting shadows across the room, but the warmth never seemed to reach Ethan. Somewhere beyond the closed doors, the inheritance gathering continued, yet it felt distant now, as though the rest of the world had slowly faded away. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asked quietly. Ethan lowered his eyes. For years he had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without hesitation. He had stood before hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and skeptical boards. Yet speaking to the woman who had stood beside him through every stage of his journey suddenly felt impossible. "I think it is time for us to move forward separately," he finally said. The words landed gently. Their impact did not. Naomi remained perfectly still. No anger crossed her face. No accusation followed. Only silence. The kind of silence that revealed more pain than any argument ever could. Ethan had expected tears. Questions. Resistance. Instead, he found himself unsettled by her calm. "Why?" she asked. Her voice remained steady. Ethan turned away again. Vanessa's warnings echoed inside his mind. The uncertainty surrounding the inheritance. The board's concerns. The growing suspicion that Richard Whitmore's final plans involved conditions nobody fully understood. Every conversation during the past several weeks had pushed him toward the same conclusion. Simplify the future. Remove uncertainty. Protect the company. Protect the legacy. "Things have changed," he said. "The family needs stability." Naomi absorbed the answer. "And you believe I threaten that stability?" Ethan hesitated. For a moment, guilt flickered across his face. "I believe difficult decisions have to be made. The answer told her everything she needed to know. This was not really about their marriage. It was about fear. Fear disguised as logic. Fear disguised as responsibility. Fear disguised as leadership. Naomi slowly nodded. I see. Outside the window, light rain had begun falling over Manhattan. Tiny droplets traced silver paths across the glass. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a folded document. He placed it carefully on the table between them. Separation papers. Prepared long before tonight. Naomi stared at the envelope. Not because she was shocked, but because of what it revealed. This conversation had not begun this evening. It had begun weeks ago. Perhaps months ago. Somewhere along the way, decisions had been made without her knowledge. She looked at the envelope but made no move to touch it. Instead, her eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting on a nearby shelf. It had been taken 6 years earlier during the opening of Whitmore Holdings' first international office in London. Ethan was smiling. So was she. Back then, they looked like two people building a future together. Now they looked like strangers separated by time. Naomi stood slowly. Ethan expected an argument. Instead, she simply smoothed the sleeve of her black gown and met his eyes one final time. I hope whatever you are protecting is worth what you are giving up, she said softly. The words were not bitter. They were honest. That honesty somehow hurt more than anger ever could. Without another word, Naomi walked toward the door. Behind her, Ethan remained motionless beside the fireplace. The envelope sat untouched on the table. The rain continued to fall beyond the glass. And for the first time in many years, the future of the Whitmore empire no longer felt secure. It felt empty. Rain followed Naomi all the way home. By the time she entered the penthouse she had once shared with Ethan, Manhattan had disappeared behind a curtain of silver mist. The city lights blurred beyond the windows, transforming the skyline into scattered streaks of gold and white. The silence inside felt unfamiliar. For years the apartment had been filled with conversations about expansion plans, future dreams, and impossible goals. Tonight, it felt like a museum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. Naomi moved slowly through the rooms. She did not cry. She did not call friends. She did not search for explanations. Some truths revealed themselves only after silence had done its work. Near midnight, she began gathering a few personal belongings. Not because she planned to leave immediately, but because staying suddenly felt impossible. As she opened a cabinet inside Ethan's private study, something slipped from the back of a shelf and landed softly on the hardwood floor. Naomi bent down and picked it up. It was an envelope. Thick. Ivory-colored. Sealed with dark blue wax bearing the Whitmore family crest. Her breath caught. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Richard Whitmore. Ethan's father. The envelope carried only 4 words. For Naomi. Personally. Confusion washed over her. Richard had passed away 3 months earlier. Why had nobody mentioned this letter? Why had it been hidden inside a private cabinet? Naomi carried the envelope to the living room and sat beside the window overlooking the river. For several minutes she simply stared at it. Richard had always treated her differently than the rest of the family. While others focused on status and appearances, he paid attention to character. He asked difficult questions. He listened carefully. And years ago, during a family gathering in Connecticut, he had told her something she never forgot. Wealth can build buildings, Naomi. Character builds legacies. With trembling fingers, she finally broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a smaller legal document folded beneath it. Naomi unfolded the first page. The familiar handwriting filled the paper. My dear Naomi, if you are reading this, it means events have unfolded exactly as I feared they might. The words immediately drew her attention. Richard continued by describing concerns he had carried during the final years of his life. He spoke of ambition, pride, and the dangers of confusing inheritance with worthiness. Then came a sentence that made Naomi sit perfectly still. Of everyone connected to this family, you are the person I trust most to protect what truly matters. Her eyes moved quickly across the remaining paragraphs. Richard described watching her support Ethan through failures and victories. He described seeing kindness when nobody was watching. Integrity when compromise would have been easier. Leadership without ego. Then she reached the attached document. The legal language was unmistakable. Naomi reread the page once. Then twice. Then a third time. Her heart pounded. Hidden inside Richard Whitmore's final estate plan was a confidential designation. The future steward mentioned during the inheritance announcement. The individual chosen to oversee the Whitmore Legacy Trust if specific conditions were met. Naomi Carter Whitmore. The room seemed to fall silent. Outside, the rain continued tapping gently against the glass. Inside, everything had changed. Ethan believed he was protecting the future of the Whitmore empire. Yet the man who built that empire had already made his choice. And the woman Ethan had asked to walk away was the very person his father had entrusted to carry the family legacy forward. The following 12 months transformed everything. Naomi never announced the contents of Richard Whitmore's letter. She never called reporters. She never challenged Ethan publicly. Instead, she quietly hired independent legal counsel, completed every review required by the trust, and followed the exact instructions Richard had left behind. While headlines speculated about uncertainty within the Whitmore empire, Naomi disappeared from the social circles that once defined her life. She sold nothing. She demanded nothing. She simply stepped away and began building something of her own. Across Manhattan, Ethan threw himself deeper into work. At first, the separation seemed like the correct decision. The board praised his focus. Investors welcomed stability. Vanessa remained his closest advisor. Yet beneath the surface, small cracks began appearing. Longtime executives resigned unexpectedly. Strategic partnerships stalled. Several senior managers who had trusted Naomi's judgment left for competitors. None of the problems seemed catastrophic on their own. Together, however, they slowly eroded the confidence that had once surrounded Whitmore Holdings. Ethan noticed the difference even if he refused to admit it. Naomi had never occupied a formal leadership position, yet her absence left an unmistakable void. Meanwhile, Richard's legal team continued completing the final stages of the inheritance review. Every requirement outlined within the confidential trust structure was carefully verified. Character assessments. Leadership evaluations. Philanthropic oversight. Independent recommendations. One by one, the conditions were fulfilled. Then, almost exactly 1 year after the inheritance announcement, invitations arrived for the annual Whitmore Legacy Foundation Gala. The event attracted business leaders, politicians, philanthropists, and members of the national press. As guests entered the historic ballroom of the Grand Regency Hotel, conversations centered around one question. Who would ultimately control Richard Whitmore's legacy trust? Crystal chandeliers illuminated the room with warm golden light. Cameras flashed. Reporters moved between tables collecting comments from executives and board members. Ethan arrived shortly after 7 o'clock wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. Confidence still surrounded him, but it no longer carried the effortless certainty it once had. As he greeted guests, he noticed something unusual. People seemed distracted. Anticipatory. As though everyone expected something significant to happen. Then the ballroom doors opened. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a brief second before rushing forward. Naomi stepped inside. She wore a midnight blue gown that reflected the chandelier light like liquid sapphire. Her posture remained calm, elegant, unshaken. There was no bitterness in her expression. No desire for revenge. Only quiet confidence earned through a year of difficult choices. Beside her walked several respected attorneys and foundation trustees. The sight immediately captured attention throughout the room. Ethan felt his breath catch. He had not seen her in nearly a year. Yet what struck him was not her appearance. It was her presence. She seemed stronger somehow. More certain. Like someone who had finally discovered exactly who she was. Around the ballroom, whispers spread rapidly. Board members stood to greet her. Trustees approached with visible respect. Even individuals who had once ignored her now moved eagerly to shake her hand. Ethan watched the reactions unfold with growing confusion. Across the room, Naomi briefly met his gaze. She offered a small, polite nod. Nothing more. No accusation. No triumph. No anger. Just dignity. And somehow that quiet dignity carried more power than anything he had seen in years. The chairman of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation stepped onto the stage. Precisely at 8 o'clock. The ballroom lights softened. Conversations faded. Hundreds of guests turned toward the podium as cameras focused on the trustees seated behind it. Ethan remained at his table, his attention fixed on Naomi. Across the room, she sat calmly among foundation board members and legal advisors, showing none of the nervousness that filled the air around everyone else. The chairman welcomed the audience and spoke briefly about Richard Whitmore's vision. He described responsibility, integrity, service, values that could not be measured on financial statements. Then he opened a leather folder and removed a sealed document. The room grew completely silent. 1 year ago, he began, questions were raised regarding the future stewardship of the Whitmore Legacy Trust. Tonight, those questions will finally be answered. Reporters immediately raised their cameras. Several executives leaned forward in their seats. Ethan felt tension settle across his shoulders. Beside him, Vanessa maintained a composed expression, but even she appeared uneasy. The chairman continued. Richard Whitmore believed leadership was not inherited through blood alone. He believed it was earned through character. The words sounded familiar. Ethan remembered hearing his father say them many times throughout his childhood. At the time, he had viewed them as philosophy. Tonight, they sounded like judgment. The chairman unfolded the document and began reading the final designation. He outlined the extensive review process completed during the previous 12 months. Independent trustees had evaluated leadership history, ethical conduct, philanthropic service, professional judgment. Every requirement Richard Whitmore established had been reviewed and confirmed. Ethan listened carefully. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Then came the sentence that changed everything. After full legal verification and completion of all conditions established by Richard Whitmore, the designated steward of the Whitmore Legacy Trust is Naomi Carter Whitmore. For several seconds, nobody moved. The announcement seemed almost impossible to process. Then a wave of astonishment swept through the ballroom. Reporters began typing furiously. Board members exchanged shocked glances. Trustees smiled knowingly. Ethan simply stared at the stage. He was certain he had heard incorrectly. Yet the chairman continued speaking. Documents appeared on screens positioned throughout the ballroom. Richard's personal letters. Legal certifications. Signed directives. Every piece of evidence confirmed the same truth. Naomi had been chosen. Not because she married into the family. Not because of public perception. Because Richard himself had trusted her above everyone else. Ethan felt the world narrow around him. Memories flooded back with painful clarity. Naomi staying awake beside him during difficult negotiations. Naomi encouraging employees during uncertain times. Naomi helping him rebuild after failed ventures. Naomi protecting the company's reputation when others walked away. Suddenly he understood what his father had seen. What he himself had overlooked. Across the ballroom, Naomi rose to her feet as applause slowly filled the room. It was not triumphant applause. It was respectful. Earned. The kind of recognition that could not be purchased. Ethan watched her accept the moment with the same grace she had always shown. No arrogance. No revenge. No bitterness. Only quiet dignity. And as the applause grew louder, Ethan realized something far more devastating than losing control of an inheritance. He had spent an entire year believing he was protecting his future. In reality, he had pushed away the very person his father believed was essential to preserving it. The applause gradually faded, but the impact of the announcement remained suspended in the air like the final note of a symphony. Naomi stood beneath the chandelier light while trustees, executives, and community leaders approached to congratulate her. She thanked each person with quiet grace, never allowing the moment to become about victory. Because to Naomi, this had never been about winning. It had been about honoring the trust Richard Whitmore had placed in her. Across the ballroom, Ethan remained seated. For the first time in his professional life, he felt completely unprepared. Numbers could be analyzed. Markets could be predicted. Competitors could be challenged. But there was no strategy for confronting the realization that he had been wrong. Not about business. About people. About the woman who had spent years standing beside him while asking for nothing in return. As guests slowly returned to their conversations, Ethan rose from his chair and crossed the ballroom. The crowd seemed to part naturally as he approached Naomi. Several trustees exchanged glances before politely stepping away. Within moments, they stood facing one another for the first time since the announcement. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them carried the weight of an entire year. Finally, Ethan looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. "My father chose well," he said quietly. Naomi studied him for a moment. There was no arrogance left in his expression. Only honesty. "Your father believed in people," she replied. "Sometimes more than they believed in themselves." Ethan nodded slowly. The truth of those words settled heavily on his shoulders. "I owe you an apology." Naomi listened without interruption. "I convinced myself I was protecting the future," he continued. "I thought I was making the responsible choice. Looking back now, I realize I was protecting my fears." The confession was simple. Unpolished. Real. Naomi saw something she had not seen in a long time. Humility. For years, success had insulated Ethan from self-reflection. Now life had stripped away that illusion. "Fear has a way of disguising itself as certainty," she said gently. Ethan gave a small, regretful smile. "I should have trusted you." Naomi looked around the ballroom. The foundation trustees. The scholarship recipients seated near the stage. The charitable programs Richard had spent decades supporting. The legacy was bigger than either of them. "Trust cannot be rebuilt by wishing for the past," she said. "It can only be earned in the present." Ethan absorbed the words carefully. He understood what she was saying. Some doors could be reopened. Others could not. And that decision belonged to the person who had been asked to walk away. The orchestra began playing softly once more. Golden light reflected from crystal glasses. Beyond the windows, Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky. It looked remarkably similar to the evening when everything had fallen apart. Yet somehow everything was different. Naomi extended her hand. Ethan looked at it briefly before shaking it. Not as husband and wife. Not as opponents. But as two people finally seeing the truth clearly. Take care of yourself, Ethan, she said. He nodded. You too, Naomi. As she walked toward the stage to begin her first official address as steward of the Whitmore Legacy Trust, Ethan remained where he stood. He watched her move forward with confidence, purpose, and dignity. There was sadness in his heart. Regret too. But there was also understanding. Richard Whitmore had been right all along. Wealth could build an empire. Influence could protect it. Power could expand it. But character was the only thing capable of preserving it. And sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money, property, or control. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is the wisdom to recognize the value of a good person before it is too late.